What I'd like to talk to you today about is home canning and basically the safety of canning and why we should matter about the concerns with that. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the extension services, but we are in every county in the state. And sometimes we're known for gardening, the gardening people. Sometimes they're like, oh, you're the canning lady. Yes, I'm the canning lady in Salt Lake County. So there's one in every county. And what we do is we take the research from USDA and give it to the people in settings just like this so that we all know the safest way to preserve our food. So we're going to talk today about canning. If you have questions with the topic I'm talking about, you can go ahead and raise your hand. We might get to it further on if it doesn't relate to what we're saying. But if you're dying and you're afraid you're going to forget the question, feel free to raise your hand and we can address that question as we go. So first I wanted to point out this beautiful picture collage. This was taken by my friend. She lives in upstate New York. But I think that it shows the sentiment of canning very well, especially with that beautiful little girl who's eating some of those berries and some of that jam that she made. How many of you are canners by raise of hand? Okay, you've been there, done that kind of thing. How many of you have never touched it, maybe want to get into it? A few of you. Okay, good. Good, good. We have a good mix. What are some benefits of canning? Food storage. Less preserves. What do you mean by that? Okay. You know it's homegrown. Less preservatives. Is that what you meant? Okay. Any other reasons why we can?
Well, I do my food without sugar, and that's nice.
Yeah, you can adjust the sugar levels. Great. Low sugar recipes. Quality control. What else? How many of you? Using your surplus. If you grow a garden, have a little orchard, it's a great way to keep stuff from going bad. Very true. Any other reasons? To save money. Okay, I was going to ask. How many of you think it saves money? How many? You think it can? Yeah. And I think, especially if you're growing your own food, it can be very cost-friendly. But if you have to go buy your food, it may or may not equal about what you could pay at the store. But then you don't get the taste, right? A lot of people can their food because they like the taste better than store-bought. And the quality control and where you can control some of those things. So we're going to talk today about the things you can change, the things you can't change, and what you need to be aware of. How many of you, if I told you that this meat may or may not be cooked properly, and it may not have gotten hot enough, how many of you would eat it? Nobody? You would? Okay. Okay, why wouldn't we? We don't want to get sick. How do you know you're going to get sick? Okay, if it's not, how do we know that? Science, right? So some scientists somewhere have figured it out, that unless we cook meat to a certain temperature, there are chances that there's going to be bacteria and things on that could get us sick. It's not a guarantee. You know, it's not guaranteed that if I eat a slab of raw meat, I'm going to get sick. Just depends if that meat has that bacteria on it. But science has shown us that if we cook it to a certain temperature, we're guaranteed not to have that on it. And that's become a wide-known thing. That's why almost none of you wanted to eat that if I told you I couldn't guarantee that it was cooked all the way. It's become widely known for us, and we know that about our meat. Canning, however, we've kind of lost some of that, and we don't realize that there is science attached to canning, and there are scientists who are continually studying how to preserve food properly so that molds, bacteria, yeast, and all those little germs don't turn into something that could make us sick, ruin our food, or perhaps get us so sick that we could die. So that's what we're going to talk today about, is how to make sure we're following the science of canning so that our food looks great, tastes great, and we stay safe. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about these things specifically. So like I said, if you have questions regarding them, you can wait till we get to it. We're going to talk about why canning is not cooking. It's a science. We're going to talk about where to go for safe canning information. We're going to talk about what's boiling water canning and what's pressure canning. and what steam canning is. We're going to talk about why we have to add acid to our tomatoes, why we have to make altitude adjustments, or why we need to be aware of what our altitude is, where we're canning, what we cannot safely can, some things that we can adjust safely, and then a big number one question we almost always have is how long does this food stay safe once we've canned it? So the first one is canning isn't cooking. So I've kind of talked about a little bit about the science of it. But how many of you, when you're cooking in your kitchen, will change a recipe, maybe even every time you make it? Okay, what types of things do you change?
Just the spices.
Spices. What other things do you change?
Vegetables.
Vegetables, in and out. Yeah. Any other things you might change when you're cooking? Uh-huh. Okay, your meatloaf, spaghetti you'll make different. What kinds of changes do you make? What kind of changes will you make? Okay, you don't use the recipe. Okay. Yeah. And the other changes we make when we're cooking? Different meats you might interchange. Yeah. So I think when we're in the kitchen, we might feel like maybe we have to make a substitute because we don't have the right ingredients. So those are things we can do when we're cooking. A science, though, needs to be kind of followed. Think back to a chemistry class in junior high and what happens when you add certain things together. And if you were off, you could have a major disaster with your chemicals. And science is kind of that way. We have to be careful that there are things we can change and things we can't change. When we're canning products, we should always follow USDA scientifically tested methods. As I mentioned, they've been tested to make sure that oxygen is removed properly because oxygen will help bacteria, yeast, and molds continue to grow and produce. And it will also make sure that it has the right temperature to kill those things. So the science has been done, and we need to be sure not to adjust our recipes. With that said, I will talk later about the safe things we can adjust. But generally, you need to follow those by item by item. Who knows what botulism is? Okay, a few of you. So botulism, it actually is started from a little germ called Clostridium botulinum, and that's something we might breathe in and out every day, no big deal. It's in dirt, it's on food, it's on the walls, it's around. But not until that becomes trapped in a little airtight environment can it produce a toxin, which they call botulism. And that botulism toxin can be very, very deadly. Very, very deadly. And we actually had a case of it in Utah just a few years ago. I remember hearing it on the news. Somebody had botulism. They didn't die from it, fortunately, but it can be very, very deadly. Some symptoms of it: double vision, blurred vision, droopy eyelids, slurred speech, difficulty swallowing, dry mouth, muscle weakness. I heard a presenter once, they weren't actually talking about canning. She was talking about something else, but she is a canner. And she said, we can, my family cans, we follow USDA methods, and all my kids know the symptoms of botulism. So that if the next day we've all eaten something and we're all feeling sick, they know to grab that can of whatever we ate and take it with them to the doctor and say, might I have botulism? And I thought, that's great. That's great that as home canners, they know what it is and to be aware of it. One of the things I've read about botulism that makes it so deadly is that they don't know what it is until it's a little too late. And so that's what makes it deadly. Not that the toxin can be deadly, of course, but if they can find it soon enough, they can help with it. So I thought that was great. So I added it in here so we know what botulism is. It's definitely not something we want to play with, which is one reason why we pay attention to how we're canning. If in doubt, if you're not sure whether or not your food might have been processed properly, throw it out. It's always better safe than sorry. There are some warning signs, although the toxin itself is tasteless, doesn't have a color, and it's odorless. But if you have a container that's leaking or bulging or swollen, probably get rid of that one. If it looks damaged or cracked or abnormal, just get rid of that as well. If it splurts a lot of liquid or foam when you open it, just toss that. And of course, if it's moldy or discolored, you can get rid of that as well. And just because of how deadly it is, you don't want to taste any food that you might think, is it contaminated? Because again, botulism is tasteless. So, where do we go to get this scientific tested canning stuff? The nice thing about this is the science is done for us. We don't have to figure out the science in our own kitchens. It's been done for us, and all we have to do is follow that. So the little pamphlet you received, raise your hand if you don't have one. I'll get you one. Okay. This has information on where to go, and I'll walk through them. You can just take one and pass it down. I'll walk through these one by one. So the first one to go to is the USDA's canning guide. So this comes straight from USDA, and I'll pass these around so you can see them. This is available online for free. You can download it to your computer. You could print it. You could also buy it. We do have some in most of the extension offices in Utah. I bet you could find a copy. This was updated in 2009 with brand new information, not very long ago. And it's really neat to actually see the kinds of changes that were made. This is just a printed copy, and I'll pass this around, but everything that's highlighted are new changes that were made. So some of them were for full new recipes, so they've done some research to include some new recipes that we can make. But some of them are just also specifications and things to clarify the science. So there's been some changes even recently that have been made. USDA Canning Guide is great. It's kind of like the Canning Bible, I like to call it. A basic canning, it goes through the main principles. It goes through canning of fruit and tomatoes and vegetables and pickling and jams and jellies. And it's step by step. One of the great things about this is if you turn and open a page, this one has a recipe for apple pie filling. It will tell you how much you'll need, how many apples you're going to need, what exactly to do with them. It will tell you step by step how to prepare that apple pie filling. And then it has this little chart that's based on altitude right there in the recipe. And I'll go over why altitude's important in a minute. But it's nice that it's right there beneath each recipe. Where other books, you kind of have to dig through the first 3 pages and you have to do some math to figure out how many minutes to add. So that's the great thing about the Canning Bible, or the USDA Complete Guide to Canning. You have it in your pamphlet. It's available through homefoodpreservation.org. And like I said, it's free, but you can buy it in probably most extension offices in your county for $10 to $15, depending on how they print it and order it. In our office, I think it's about $15 for this nice bound color copy. So I'll just pass it around so you can quickly browse through it and see what it is. Another great source of safe canning information is the Ball Blue Book of Preserving. And if you don't have one of these two, I would probably throw your old one out and get a new one. Because again, USDA made changes in 2009. These are 2009 and newer, so I would probably toss those and get yourself a new one. This one was just their centennial version, but they're more or less the same book. Ball Blue Book is great. It has a lot of fun recipes. It has great diagrams to show you a step-by-step canning. Let me show you one real quickly. Just with pictures, and it will just show you step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. So that's a great thing about this. It also in the very back has a troubleshooting guide. So you want to know why your jar is cracked or how come you lost liquid. It will tell you what to do to fix that in the future. So these are great books. They're cheaper too. You can pick them up at most grocery stores, most extension offices, for maybe $6, $7, $8 is all. Nice thing about the Ball Blue Book is it also includes drying and freezing, where the USDA Canning Guide is just canning. So I'll get these over here so you can see those as well. Actually, I'll do one on each side. The bad thing about this one is it does not have altitude on each recipe. So you have to turn to page 5, see how many minutes you need to add, and then you have to go back to your recipe and add a few minutes, 5 to 15 minutes, depending on where you live. So that just takes a little more math, and you've got to remember to look at page 5 to remember how much altitude to add. Another great resource is a book called So Easy to Preserve. This is put out by the University of Georgia Extension. They are kind of the home of the Home Food Preservation, National Home Food Preservation Center. And this is a great book, So Easy to Preserve. It doesn't have pretty diagrams like the Ball Blue Book does, but it has a lot of recipes, kind of with a southern flair, really good sections on dehydrating and freezing. They also have a DVD that is awesome. They paid actors, and they're great. They show you a whole bunch of ways to can and the canning methods. You can check these out for sure from the Salt Lake County office. I'm sure other offices in the state you could check them out as well. And I did order them in most of the libraries throughout the state too. So the libraries, you should be able to put a hold on it and check it out there. So this is a great, if you're gonna, maybe you're teaching a class for a church or community group, maybe you want to teach your daughters or get your friends involved, this would be a great thing to check out. You could watch a video on how to make jam, and then you could turn around and make jam. Very fun to watch, and man, it makes you want a can, that's for sure. It makes you excited to get into that garden produce. This book can be a little more expensive. It's about $20, I believe, if not a little bit more. You can purchase it on Amazon, or it's through the University of Georgia's website, which is in your pamphlet as well. So we'll get that one going. And the only other place that you can guarantee will be a safe canning recipe is an extension website, whether that's Utah State University, University of Idaho, University of Georgia, any extension or land-grant university. Some of them have their own food scientists that might do some testing on their own, but all extension services across the country follow USDA guidelines, so you can be ensured that those publications from them will also include that. But really, that's kind of about it. That's about where our safe canning things stop, with one exception. I keep forgetting to add to this. Any commercial product, like a pectin box or pectin container, those kinds of commercial products for canning, you can also follow their recipes as they're safe as well. But that's kind of it. So if you're doing a Google search, maybe you have a ball book, but it doesn't have a recipe you want, so you just hit the Google, open it up, and you want a specific recipe. Make sure it's USDA approved or comes from a land-grant university. Otherwise, it could just be some blogger out there that decided to cook their own recipe, and we don't really know if it's scientifically tested to ensure that it was the right temperature for the right amount of time, to get rid of the oxygen, and all of that stuff. So just user beware when we come to canning. These for sure are the safe ones that will give us that safe product. Any questions on those? Ball Blue Book also has a big fat book, and they have a great website, the Ball Preserving. It's called freshpreserving.com, and it's in your pamphlet. But they also have a thicker book, The Complete Guide to Canning. I can't remember what they call it, but it's by the Ball Company. Carolyn, do you know what it's called? It's a ball book, but it's a fat one, not the little skinny one. The Complete Home Guide to Canning. Okay. Okay, thank you, Carolyn. So she said that other thicker ball book is actually published in Canada. They use some wine and alcohol in some of their recipes, and USDA doesn't approve that as safety. So use with caution. Thanks. So we'll stick with this list for there. Any questions on those? And you do have those in your pamphlet. A lot of them are available online. Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to why some of these things are important. So boiling water bath canning. Sometimes it's called cold packing, but really the correct term is a boiling water canner. And this is basically, I had to park like a mile away, so I didn't end up hauling it in. But usually you see them in a black container, a black pot. It's a kind of a thinner metal, and it has the same color lid. But you can use any pot that you can cover your jars with at least 2 inches of water. Boiling water canning is for foods that are high acid. Who could throw out some high acid foods? We'll pause on tomatoes. Fruits, yes. Anything else? Jams and jellies, yep, high sugar, yep, they're made with fruits generally. So that's kind of about it. Salsa, because we add vinegar or lemon juice, which makes it acidic. Salsa, and pickles also, because they're so vinegary. That's kind of all. That's what we do in a boiling water canner. Tomatoes, you can, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is where the water must cover the jars with at least 2 inches, with some to spare depending on how long it has to process. And you start the process when the water boils. So that's when you start your timer, when that is a full rolling boil. Some things like juice, for example, if you're just canning apple juice or grape juice, really only need 5 or 10 minutes, depending on your altitude, of processing. And that's really just to push the air particles out, bring down that lid to get a really good vacuum seal, but it still does need processed. So that's kind of a newer recommendation by the USDA and the Ball Canning Company as well, is to process everything. So everything that goes in a can should at least be boil water canned. And that's kind of a new recommendation. And that, again, makes sure that you have a good vacuum seal. It will prevent mold and yeast from growing inside your product. It will also keep it shelf stable, so it can stay on your shelf for a longer period of time. I will not go into the details of how to use specifically a boil water canner, but on your pamphlet, it has a link to a fantastic user-friendly paper that walks you through step-by-step. It's called Principles for Boiling Water Canning. It's the fourth from the bottom. It's available online, and you could always go to an extension office to pick that up as well. But it will just walk you through step-by-step how to use that. Very easy to use, and the most important thing is just that you remember the water covers those jars by 2 inches, so it needs to be a high enough jar, or a high enough canner to cover the jars. Pressure canning is for low acid foods. You can also do high acid foods in it for a shorter period of time. The canning guides will show you how to do that. But generally, it's for low acid foods. Let's shout out some low acid foods. Meat, vegetables. Yep, that basically covers those, our foods. We've got meat, vegetables. And I'll show you this little chart, and then I'll pass it around so you can see a little bit. But this is just a food acidity chart. So up here at the top are high acidic foods. Down here at the bottom are alkali, or kind of neutral foods. So we've got beans down here, and we've got lemons up here. As you can see, tomatoes are kind of right here across the middle, and we'll talk about tomatoes in a little bit. But high acid foods, they need to reach a temperature of 212 degrees to really kick out all those organisms and get a good preserved product. And we can reach that in a boiling water canner. Who knows what temperature boils at in Salt Lake City? Anybody know? 212 is at sea level. Does anybody know? Think back to chemistry class. Any scientists in here? What do you think? Is higher or lower? Lower, actually. So in Salt Lake, water boils at about 204, 206 degrees. So that's how come we have to add time to our processing, is because we need to reach 112 degrees to really preserve these foods well. Now below, these low acid foods, they need 250 degrees. And no matter how long you boil something, it will never reach 250 degrees. And that's why you use a pressure canner, because steam gets a lot hotter than boiling water does. So in a pressure canner, it's kind of opposite. You only put a little bit of water in there, and then you build up this steam pressure inside the pressure canner, and that steam will get really hot. So that's why you have to use a pressure canner for low acid foods, because they need a higher temperature, which can't be done with boiling water. You have to make that steam inside that locked steam pressure canner. And actually, we'll pass it around so you can see. So pressure canners can be a little bit tricky. I think a lot of people are afraid of them, but there's a step-by-step guide. Again, you've got the link for it in that little packet. But step-by-step guide on how to use them, how to prepare your pressure canner, and it's safe as long as you follow those guidelines and you've got a properly working pressure canner. This is just the lid of it, by the way. But you need to get these gauges tested if they're a dial gauge. Sometimes there's just a little knob you sit on top, and that's called a weight. If you have a weight and you're using your weight, you don't necessarily need to get this tested. Some don't even come with this kind. So we've had some people come into our office to get it tested, and they only have the weight. Those don't need tested. But we need to just make sure that when this says 10, it's actually reading 10 and not 15 or 9 or 7, so that we can make the adjustments or replace it as needed. But pressure canners, when you seal it in and you have your food in there ready to go, you vent it, and all the steam comes out for 10 minutes. That's an important thing before you start counting the pressure building, and then you start your processing time. And like I said, even I pressure can every once in a while, but I always pull out that pressure canning guide, which you have the link for in that brochure, and I just follow that step by step. Because sometimes I get mixed up between, what vents for 10 minutes and what has to be 3 inches this way or that way, and so I just make sure I'm following those guides. And again, the most important thing is that you have this tested annually, if you're using it annually. Every time you go to use it, make sure it's been tested at least once a year. Any extension office in the state can test those for you. Some might charge a little bit. Some might have free. Just check with your county office. So those are for low acid foods. Steam canning. How many of you know what a steam canner is? You probably have one. Okay, I know my parents had one, but that's kind of opposite, where it has a little tiny base with a big dome lid on top, and you put the jars in there, and there's steam in there but it doesn't get pressured steam. So if I were to have you open to certain pages in all those books I've passed around, you would not see any directions on how to use a steam canner. It would tell you how to use a boiling water canner, how to use a pressure canner, but you would not find anything on steam canning, and if you did, it would say, do not use them. A few years ago, a food scientist here in Utah, on campus in Logan at Utah State University, the manufacturers of these steam canners came up to them and said, hey, everybody's telling us that we don't want to test them, we don't want to approve them because we've got pressure canners, we've got the water baths, we don't need another product. Will you test them for me? So he tested them. And the main concern is that you can't verify, you can't see that steam in there to make sure it's getting high enough. But he determined that don't go out and buy one, first of all, if you're going to. It's probably better just to use a boiling water canner. But if you have one and you're going to use it anyway, make sure that it's only for high acid fruits, not including pickles, not including salsas, jams, jellies, juice, peaches, fruits, just fruits, fruit products, and that you follow specific guidelines. So our recommendation would be stick with water bath canning, stick with pressure canning, but if you have one and you're going to use it, you have a link in your brochure that will give you step-by-step guides on how to use it safely for fruits only. Okay, let's talk about tomatoes a little bit. Over the years, tomatoes have been bred by food scientists and horticulturists, or whoever does the breeding of these things, to be less acidic so that they taste better to us and we don't get canker sores in our mouth like crazy. And it might help. I'm not sure. I should ask some horticulturists if it actually helps the food grow better as well. I'm not sure. But over the years, they have made them be less acidic. Even when we grow our own, the acidity levels are less in those than they used to be. So because they're less acidic, you saw that cutoff point on that chart that's passing around. They they stick pretty close to that cutoff point, give or take some. So we've got to add acid to our tomatoes to make them safe enough. And this is, again, you can find them in any of these canning guides. It will walk through specifically how and how much acid to add. If you just open up to the tomato section, it will talk through it to you. But basically, one of the easiest things to do is bottled lemon juice. And as you've got your hot jars there waiting to fill them with tomatoes, just go ahead and pour lemon juice directly into each empty, clean jar. So you would do 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice. Make sure it's 5% per quart jar, or 1 tablespoon per pint. Or you can use ascorbic or citric acid as well, and that's just a tiny little half teaspoon.
Does it have anything to do with the color of the tomatoes?
No, it does not have anything to do with the colored tomatoes. They vary from tomato to tomato. Heirloom, non-heirloom, they just kind of all vary. And so USDA has come out and said add them to every tomato. Now, products like salsa that doesn't count. So if you're making salsa, you don't necessarily add more lemon because you're adding vinegar or lemon juice, and you'll follow those directions appropriately. So these are just for plain old tomatoes. Whether they're whole tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, diced tomatoes, tomato juice, etc., all the tomato products.
Why does it matter?
No, that's a good point. So why does it matter? Acid is a preservative. It will help preserve food. It also is that cutoff point kind of between what we pressure can and what we boil water bath. Mostly it's a preservative. So if we have tomatoes that are not acidic enough, we might under-process them. So we might not process it enough to really kill all the microorganisms inside of it to keep it safe. So it could either grow something that we don't want to grow in there, or the product could diminish sooner. Yeah, even if you're pressure canning, they say to add it to it. You can do both with tomatoes. You can boil water bath, or you can pressure can. The time varies significantly. These are actually tomatoes I canned from my garden last fall. I was 7 months pregnant. I was very tired that day. But I boil watered them in the canner. I think it was 90 minutes the way I did it. 90 minutes. But if I had pressure canned them, I just can't because I have a glass top stove. I can't pressure can in my kitchen. But if I had pressure canned, it would have been, I think, like 30 minutes. Or maybe even less than that. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll grab a book from you in a second. Some you can, some you can't. So if you have a glass top stove, check with your manufacturer and see what their guidelines are. Mine, I can't. But I have on some. So just read the little booklet or call your manufacturer and find out. The problem is a lot of the heat elements will wear out the heating thing underneath the glass, and that costs almost just as much to replace as it does to buy a new stove. So just check with your manufacturer on that. So yes, add it directly to the jar before filling them with your tomatoes, whether you're boiling them in a boiling water canner or pressure canning them. So that's what's up with that. And that was added a few years ago, I think in the early 90s. So anything earlier than the 90s, if you have any old cookbooks around, be sure to look at those. Speaking of cookbooks, I actually was just in my Betty Crocker the other day, and I noticed it had a canning section. I was like, I'm going to see what Betty has to say about canning. And I opened it up, and it had one page, and it said, due to changes of USDA, they don't have any canning recipes in there, and they said contact your local extension services or the USDA. And I was like, woohoo! So they've taken stuff out. So be aware of that, too, in some of your canning cookbooks. Make sure if they're in there that they are USDA-approved recipes. But they are kind of shifting out of publishing those. Let's talk about altitude. I did a little bit as I told you that boiling water or water boils at a lower temperature here in Salt Lake than it does if we were at sea level. As altitude increases, the boiling point of water decreases. So we need to increase the processing time to accommodate for that. So depends on where you live. Raise your hand if you do not live in Salt Lake County. Well, raise your hand if you don't live on the Wasatch Front. Okay, we all live on the Wasatch Front. If you're below 6,000 feet, between 3,000 and 6,000 feet, it will have you add, let me double check my numbers. I think 10 minutes is what it would be. Let me just grab. 5 to 10 minutes, depending on what it is, but about 5 minutes. So that's not really so bad. It's not a whole bunch more, but it is important to make sure to add those, or that's missing out on 5 minutes of prime processing time. Just like that hamburger I showed you, it might only need 5 minutes cooking, but if it doesn't get that 5 minutes cooking, it could be very undercooked. So make sure you're paying attention to that. Again, the USDA Complete Guide to Canning will tell you right on that thing. All you need to know is whether you're between 1,000 and 6,000 feet or above 6,000 feet. So if you have a cabin up in the mountains, you're canning there, maybe check to see if you're above 6,000. You might have to add even more to that. You can always over-process, and with maybe some exceptions, it wouldn't really make a big deal. It's better safe than sorry. Okay, so not all products can be canned, and I want you to just kind of think about the products in the grocery store. If we turn down the can aisle, there are all sorts of food on the shelves, and just because we see it on the shelf doesn't mean we can do it at home. One example, if I was actually going to put a picture in here of a commercial canning equipment. Some of those pressure canners are the size of this room almost. They're huge, and they can get different temperatures than we can ever get on our stove. So think of that too, that they just have equipment that we don't have. So just because you can buy it in a can doesn't mean you can make it in a can yourself. Butter is a common one we get a lot of questions on. Can we can butter? And you'll see it in shelves, especially in emergency preparedness sections of stores. You'll see like a tuna fish size can of butter. But just because you see it in a can doesn't mean you can make it in a can at home. And at this point, there is no safe process for canning butter. Hydrated wheat kernels. So if you think of just a raw wheat kernel that you grind into wheat flour, some people are taking that, putting it in water, and canning it to preserve it. Again, that has not been found to be safe. We don't know if it is or not, so that's one that at this point we don't know. Quick breads is another where they'd actually, make zucchini bread in a can so you get a cute little round loaf. You can go ahead and cook it that way, but don't stick a lid on it and try to put it on your shelf for a year. There aren't any recipes to show that that's safe. And dried beans. Now this is kind of a trick answer here. Dried beans you can actually safely can. But the trick is you can't put dry beans in a jar and fill it with water and process it. First, you have to soak your beans, drain your beans, cook your beans. Then you put the cooked bean inside a jar and process it. So that's quite the process. It takes, I had an intern do these a couple summers ago. She's like, please never make me do beans again. Just go buy the 40-cent can at the case lot sale. But if we have dried beans at home that we just can't quite get to soften enough, this is a way that it might be able to soften. It does take a lot of time. It has to be in a pressure canner for about 75 to 90 minutes. So it's quite the process, but you can safely can beans. Just make sure they're completely cooked before you stick them in a jar, not like this. No. I know, I wish we could just add water. The problem is the inside of the bean might not quite be softened enough to have the heat continuously penetrate it for that 75, 90 minutes. So cook them first, and then you can can them. Or you can always freeze them, right? There's a lot of things that we can't can, but we can freeze very easily. Another one is pureed squash, like pumpkin. So maybe you're growing pumpkin, and you want to puree it and can it. There is no safe recipe to do that, even though you can buy it pureed in a can. You can, however, if you follow the guidelines, make it in squares. You can chop it up in squares and can the squares, cubes, and then you could drain it and puree it to make your pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving or whatever. So some things, we can can pumpkin, just not canned pumpkin puree. So just follow the guidelines on those things. Any questions?
They can stew or something like that. They say you can't use a thickener or flour.
Okay. Yes, good point.
What's that all about?
So the heat penetrates through our canned product as it's in the boiling water canner, as it's in the pressure canner. That heat is getting through every little cooking nook and cranny of this food. If we add to the recipe, some recipes might call for some sort of thickener. Pie filling, for example, calls for a certain kind of thickener, but you just don't want to add. So if it looks runny to you and you're like, oh, I'm not so sure, don't add to it until you're going to eat it, because that thickener can thicken the food, which means the heat will not process the same way through that food. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it's on one of the handouts in your pamphlet, but I wasn't going to mention it. So if something looks runny, a stew, a pie filling, maybe even your jelly, oh, that just looks runny. Wait till you go to eat it to thicken it up somehow. Same can be said with spices. Go ahead and put in what it calls for, but if it's not spicy enough, wait till you go to eat it when you actually open that can to add those spices, those extra spices and thickeners to it. Great question. Okay, a few more minutes and we'll take more questions. Some things can be changed. So I've said, no, don't do this, bad, no. But there are some things you can change, and these books will talk about it too. If you open up to the sugar section in the canning jam section, we'll have a whole paragraph on sugar and what you can do and what you can't do. So am I right and you're right? Salt levels you can adjust, which is great, because we're hearing from all these health things that you should reduce your sodium intake. Except for in pickles, because that helps preserve the pickles, you can adjust that salt or even leave it out completely. And I wouldn't be surprised if the next time the USDA goes to update their canning guide, if they would leave out salt altogether. Right now it says, like, if you want to can green beans, it says add salt, optional, per jar. I wouldn't be surprised if they just kind of leave that out. So you can adjust salt levels. You can also just wait and add salt when you go to eat it. The salt is not a preservative except for in pickles when it comes to home canning. Sugar in canned fruit, jams and jellies, those things can be adjusted as well. Jams and jellies get a little tricky, but there are recipes specifically made for low or no sugar jams. There are special pectins that are formulated in a certain way for lower sugars. So if you want to adjust that, make sure you're buying the proper product to make those adjustments. I've successfully made jam with no sugar in it, just using maybe juice or just a lot of fruit and pectin. The color won't always be as bright. This is a peach strawberry jam that was a beautiful, vibrant pink color when it was first made, but the color will degrade over time. This was made 2 years ago. But it didn't stay very pretty for very long. Sugar is a preservative that will help with the color. It tastes more like fruit to me rather than sugared fruit product. So you can definitely safely make fruit. If I were to do sugar-free fruit or jams and jellies again, I would only do it in containers about this big, because as sugar's a preservative, they go moldy really fast once I open it. So I would do them in small. That's just the recommendation for me, unless you can eat it really quickly, or you're going to use it in a recipe or something. But sugar can also be reduced in things like peaches, pears, all those things that you're doing. A couple years ago for fun, I made a can of peaches, actually a whole set of peaches. What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, yes, thank you, batch. I'm like, the batch. I made a whole batch of peaches, sugar-free, just canned completely in water because I wanted to see what they were like. They were very watery. Surprise, surprise. Very, very watery and kind of they went mushy a lot more quickly. They just kind of taste like watered down peaches. But they're great in something like a peach cobbler. I like to use a very mild syrup or pineapple juice that you can use to preserve them that way as well. Carolyn? Yes, thanks. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. If you're going to leave sugar out of your fruits, like peaches and pears, you can boil those before you put them in the jars, and that will help to keep them a little more firm. So you definitely can do it safely, is my point. Yes. Either way, whether you're adding sugar or not, you can boil your fruit first. And a lot of food, like green beans, you can boil those before you put them in jars, or you can put them in just cut up. And the difference tends to be between when you boil the food and when you don't. When you boil it, you'll reduce the shrinkage before you put it in the jar. When you put them in raw, they will shrink as they cook. So you'll have what looks like not as pretty of a jar. It will look like you lost space. The hot ones always look prettier. You'll have like a less cloudy jar compared to the ones that were put in raw. But most things you can do either way. You'll just need to check the guidelines to see what they say. Does boiling kill all the nutrition? Yes and no. There are some nutrients that would be lost, but not enough to make it not worth it. You'll still have some nutrients left in there.
Quick story, when my kids were little, and I did cherries, without sugar, and my daughter was eating it with a friend. When we came home from work, she was so excited to say, "Mom, look, we just pour sugar on this and see how much better it tastes." That wasn't the point.
Yeah, very true. Sugar, of course, will make things taste better. It is a preservative too, but you can safely without them. You can always add extra vinegar or lemon juice as well. Extra won't make a difference. In salsa recipes specifically, you can decrease vegetables. So peppers, onions, you can decrease those if you don't want it so peppery or so oniony, but don't decrease the tomatoes because that also has acid that the recipe is counting on having. This is my favorite part. If you're doing salsas and you want it hotter, instead of adding more peppers, just exchange your peppers. So if it calls for half a cup of green bell peppers, you could use half a cup of jalapeno or habaneros if you want it really, really hot. Just don't go above that half a cup because peppers are very low acid. It brings down the acidity, and then we just don't know what we're playing with. Canning isn't quite to the science where we can say, if I add this much low acid, then I just increase the time this much and add this much acid. We just don't know. It's not quite to that kind of science yet. So just stick with what it says, but you can just exchange the amount of peppers. Do you have a question?
Back to the sugar. Can you make that syrup out of sugar substitute?
Can you make syrup out of sugar substitute, Carolyn? A fruit syrup, like if you're doing peaches. Can you make that out of a sugar substitute? Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah, I'm not sure either. After class, let me look in some of these books and see if there's anything. Okay, we are almost out of time, but let me just... Okay, our most frequently asked question in Salt Lake County is, I have food that has an expiration date on it of October of 2012. Can I still eat it 6 months later? or 2 years later, or 10 years later. We get all sorts of questions on how long food can store. If I were to send you on a little homework goose hunt trip through these books on shelf storage of home canned goods, you would see use within a year. That's what it would say. And obviously, people have never been to Utah, right? USDA researchers have never been to Utah, right? We have a food safety scientist on campus, Brian Newmer. He used to work at the at University of Georgia, came to Utah, and we blew him out of the water with our food storage. He's like, "What are you doing keeping wheat for 40 years?" It's really funny to talk to him. But he has told us over and over again that if a product is safely canned according to these guidelines and commercially safely canned and has not become compromised, it hasn't been in a flood, hasn't been frozen and thawed again, those kinds of things, or in extreme heat, you can count on that product being safe indefinitely. Now, it might lose some texture, it might look really weird. You might lose some nutrients over the course of time. Those nutrients will go away, but it will always have calories, is what he'll tell us. That can of peaches you did 12 years ago will still have calories in it. It might not taste good, might not have so much of the vitamins and minerals, but it will still have calories. So basically, when you're doing food, you want to make sure you label it with the date, and so you know what it is, because, I don't know, this could look like a whole bunch of things. I can't really tell it's peach strawberry jam anymore. So make sure you label it, and make sure you're rotating your food, using the oldest first, putting your newer stuff in the back, or however you have your food storage. Make sure it's safely canned. One new thing from the USDA is to take these rims off as you store them, and that helps with a few things. It can help you clean underneath, because we do get food particles that seep out during the canning process. Helps you clean it so you have a clean, safe jar, and then you can also know, I put away a pristinely clean jar. You can just wash it. Hot soapy water, stick it in the sink, hot soapy water, wash it. You know you put away a clean jar, so then if it's ever compromised in any way, if it froze and opened up and leaked out, you would know, because the jar is all sticky and gross. Or if it got a crack in it somehow, that's one thing that can help you with that storage as well. Best used within a year. That's going to be the best taste, best quality, best color, but anything after that, it will just kind of go downhill after that. Does that answer that question fairly clearly? You just take that rim right off as we store them. Nope, this is the part that vacuum seals. That band is just on top to hold it in place while it processes it. So this one isn't going to come off. See, that's another reason we take them off, is so that it doesn't erode to it and stay on forever. But you do just, once it seals, you'll wait about 24 hours. And once it's sealed, take it off and you can reuse those. Great question. Yeah, reusable canning lids. Reusable canning lids. Can you use them? Can you not? You'll get some awesome artisan jellies that will have these cute little lids that are reusable. At this point, the USDA has not tested them enough to say, yes, go ahead and use them. Yeah, and we hear that too. So our recommendation is to stick with the 2-piece lid and screw band. Yes. Yep. That's our recommendation at this point. There we go. So that you can just take off, reuse it over and over again, store it like that. Yes. That's a good question. Cheapest place to buy in bulk canning supplies. I am not sure in bulk where to buy like lids and screw bands. Is that what you mean? Screw bands you don't really need that many of. Yeah, I have only ever bought them from like grocery stores. IFA will carry them too. I've never tried bulk, but you could look on Amazon. Sometimes things are really cheap on Amazon. You do want to make sure you're using a brand new lid every time.
Some time ago, there was a scarcity with ball and cur jars. Hard time getting them. So I don't know if that's still the same.
Was that just a few years ago?
Yeah.
He said that a few years ago there was it was hard to come by jars and lids. I remember that. I think for whatever reason, people were just like, I'm going to can again. And the stores were just empty like crazy. Buy them early in the year.
It's kind of like people starting a garden too.
Yeah. It's kind of been a thing that's come back. But yeah, just look. They have them all sorts of places. Grocery stores, IFA, Cal Ranch sells them. And you can get them online. You know, even jars you could look for at places like DI and garage sales, your grandma's basement, those kinds of things. Just make sure that they're Kerr or Mason jars. or ball jars, because something like a glass mayonnaise jar, it's not tempered the same way. It could crack very easily.
I thought it was if the little things on top crossed over you.
I'm not sure about that, actually.
You know, because you look at them and
Yeah, I'm not sure about that part. But if they say the cur, what isn't? Right, yeah. It's not tempered to withstand those extreme heats. So make sure it's a time is up. Make sure it's actually meant for canning. I will take more questions if you want to come up to me, but we are out of time today. And my overall message is just make sure you're going to USDA safe approved recipes and procedures, and they will walk you through step by step what to do on those. They've got lots of stuff in their book. So thanks for coming out today, and have fun at the other classes in Expo.